So now let's take a look at the adapter pattern. So the adapter pattern it's pretty intuitive. So let's say you have two classes that want to use one another, like a class A and a class B, but let's say their interfaces are incompatible. And generally what that means is, class B expects parameters of a particular type, or it expects some additional parameters, but your class A has those parameters maybe in a different type or a different format, and then, so it kind of directly use B. So what you do is basically introduce an adapter, that's where the name comes from, which is like a compatibility layer that allows A and B to communicate, or that allows A to use B. And basically this adapter, it will well, first of all, it wraps class B, so it'll have an instance of class B, and then we'll see how that works. But basically this class will do all the necessary work that's required to make A and B compatible. So let's take a look at an example of that. So let's say we have the simple setup here. So anybody familiar with the XML and JSON formats? So they're pretty popular formats. They're used, especially JSON in recent years. XML is sort of becoming outdated nowadays. But they're two very common data formats used, especially for web services. So we just have a simple class. These don't really do anything. Their purpose here is just to serve as types. So just treat them as types. They don't really do anything. So we have XML and we have JSON, and then you can imagine you might have a HTTP server class that has a request method called request, and then it has a parameter. It takes in a parameter of type JSON, which might be like your request parameters. So you might want to call like a Google authentication service, and you have to provide a couple of parameters. And so that takes in those parameters in a JSON object, let's say. And then let's say it returns a JSON object as well. Yeah, so it takes in a parameter of type JSON. My mouse isn't showing up here. It's weird. And it also returns a type JSON. And then we have a class DB, which calls, well, it has a method called getData that returns, data in XML format. Now the problem is you have your app, which has a main method, and then you want to call this HTTP server.request, but because you're getting that data in XML format, you can't directly pass it to the HTTP server request method because it's in a JSON format. So the question is, well, what do you do here? So anybody know, based off of what you saw in lecture or just using your intuition?
Using the adapter between JSON and XML.
Between JSON and XML.
Convert it.
Okay, that's interesting. So would it be between, so an adapter that would convert between XML and JSON?
Yeah.
Okay, but which class would that adapter wrap? Anybody other than those two? No? So yeah, you're right. We'd have an adapter. Where would we place that adapter? Yeah, exactly. And what method would the adapter expose? Sorry? Yeah, it would have a request method, but what would be the type of that request method? Like what would be the, in this case, it takes in a parameter of type JSON. What would the adapter class? Yeah, and return what? Well, return JSON, right? Because you want it to behave as that, like same return type, but it's just the arguments that are different. Yeah, so great. So here's what you just mentioned. Same setup, but we introduced this HTTP server adapter class over here. So you can see that it holds a single instance of HTTP server, and then we can use that object within that class. And then it has a request method, but it takes in a parameter of type XML rather than JSON like we had in HTTP server, because you want to wrap that class and then sort of provide that compatibility layer. And then again, it returns JSON, and then we have a method that will just convert XML to JSON, and of course it takes an XML, returns JSON. And if you notice, it has an aggregation relationship, because again, HTTP server can't exist without this adapter. That's why it's not a composition relationship. Okay. Any questions about this UML diagram? So let's look at the code for this. The code is really straightforward for this one. So let me get rid of all of this stuff. Okay. We have our app, and we have our DB. We had the XML and the JSON class, which really just serve as types, just for the sake of example. They're not really going to do anything. We had the HTTP server .java. So this class had a single request method. So public JSON, it returns JSON. Request, it also takes in a JSON argument. Let's just call it parameters. And we're just going to return a new JSON object. So we're not actually going to really do anything in here. Then in JSON, just for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to make a toString method, which is part of like in every Java object. We're just going to override it to return. Let's just do JSON object, just so when we're sort of testing it out, we can see what the type of the object is. And then we're going to do the same thing in XML. And instead, we're going to do XML object. Okay, so we have our app, our JSON, XML, DB. So let's go ahead and add the methods for the DB class. So we had the get data method. So public get data. And if you remember, that returns type XML. Oops. So we're just going to return new XML. So what we've done so far is we have our DB. Ignore this field. I think I just forgot to delete that when I was making the UML diagram. But all this class does is it has the get data method. And again, it sort of uses the XML class. It has an association with it because it returns an instance of it. So we have the DB. Then we have our app, which we're going to use in a second. We have the server with the request, and then we have JSON. And then now let's take a look at the adapter. So, or actually, before we look at the adapter, let me make the problem more obvious with what we have currently. So we're going to have, first thing what we're going to do is let's just go ahead and make an instance of the DB class. So we're going to do XML data equals DB dot, let's see, was this? Let's just make this a static method, which just means it's you can call it directly on the class rather than an instance of the class. And so that means we can just do new DB dot get data rather than new DB then dot get data. So DB dot get data, so that returns XML, so we can assign that to that variable. And then so we have this data here, and then what we want to do is we want to call the HTTP server dot request. So let's create an HTTP server object, and I think this one, let's also make this static. So we don't have to instantiate it then. We can just do HTTP server dot request. And so the problem here is that this takes in an argument of type JSON, but we only have this XML data here. So my linter isn't running, which is unfortunate because this would highlight an error, but this would give you an error because, again, if you look at the method signature, even that's not showing up. Okay. If you look at HTTP server, it has a argument of type JSON, but in app.java, we only have access to the XML data. So again, this is where the adapter will come in. So let's create the adapter first. HTTP server adapter, and let's go ahead and add the 3 methods. So if you look at the methods, we have request, and then we just have a XML to JSON, and then we have a single class member called server, which just holds in a reference to the HTTP server class. And I don't think we actually need it because that class only has static methods. So anyways, public, yeah, we still want to return JSON for our request method because, again, you want it to be compatible with the HTTP server class. But instead of taking in a JSON argument, it's going to take an XML argument. And then let's just do, or first let's make the other method, which was XML to JSON. So private JSON, so it's going to return JSON, and it's basically going to do conversion between XML and JSON. So let's just call that data. And obviously, we're not actually going to implement that. We're just going to return a simple JSON object. And then in here, what we're going to do is JSON data equals XML to JSON and pass in this object, which is of type XML, params. And then we can go ahead and return it. So let's just inline that. Or sorry, we wouldn't inline it. We still have to call the, again, we're wrapping the HTTP server class. So we would call that. So we would do HTTP server dot request. And now we can pass the data because it's of type JSON rather than XML. So this is basically like where we've done the conversion, and then we can go ahead and call this, and we will return that. Okay. Any questions?
In this example, why do we use an adapter instead of making a standalone function that can from XML?
It's a good question. So typically, like this is for the sake of example, right?
Yes.
But you can imagine that you might need a bunch of different utilities, not just simple conversion. So there might be a number of things that you want to do. So you want to sort of separate that out and put it in its own class. And then the other thing is you might need different types of adapters. So this is just wrapping one of the methods. What if you had like 10 different methods that needed to be wrapped and that needed that sort of compatibility layer? So you would wrap all of those sort of in this class. Okay. But again, this is like a simple example, which we're just wrapping a simple method. Okay. But good question. So now in our app, what we can do is instead of doing HTTP server dot request, you don't interact with that directly. You're just going to call HTTP server adapter, and you can actually pass the data to it. Okay. Any questions? If not, we can go ahead and run it. And I'll do one other thing. Let's print data. And then let's assign this. Again, this returns type JSON. Let's call it result. And then let's print result. Okay, so let's run that. I might get a couple errors, so bear with me because my linter isn't running. Server.request. Oh, this is what happens when your linter isn't running. And XML to JSON. Oh. Okay, so let's look at app. So again, when we print our data, remember we had the toString method, which just prints XML object, JSON object. So what we're going to see is we're going to see XML object first, and then after the result, we're just going to see a JSON object. So we see XML object, and then we see JSON object, which is what we expect because that's what the server adapter.request returns. Okay. So any questions? So this was a pretty simple example, but as you mentioned, in this case, we don't even need this adapter. But again, you might want to wrap many different methods, and there might be a bunch of different things that you need to do in between to make sort of those two classes, A and B, that need to work together compatible. So you want to abstract all of that out and place it in its own class in this adapter class. Any other yeah?
In a realistic setting, because you're saying we're going to be placing a lot of, we're going to be adding a lot of utilities.
Right.
Would we be connecting to an adapt to an interface instead of an actual drive? So we have like a HTTP request interface instead of whatever we have.
Yeah, I can see that happening. Yeah.
That's how the adapter was.
Okay. Oh, it's like this should be an interface, you mean?
Not the adapter itself, but like the adapters connect, how the adapter is connecting to the HTTP server. So like there would be an interface before the HTTP server, which is itself an interface, and then the adapter connects to that.
So the HTTP server would be an implementation of an interface.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, interesting.
because the relations are different from what we had in class. That's just like.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah, because you want to be able to wrap different instances of a particular class. Yeah, so that's right. So what we would add to this is you would have an interface, let's say just HTTP, and then maybe you have different classes that provide different HTTP facilities, and each of those are in their own class. Yeah, and then you want to be able to wrap any of them. So you would actually have a relationship between this class and that interface rather than HTTP server. So yeah, good call out. Yeah, I'll add that in before I post these slides. Okay. Other questions? If not, you guys are free to go. That's all, and I'll see you all next week.